Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Talking Stick. My name is Jess, and I am your hostess with the mostest. No, I'm just kidding. Here we are again, still going further into our study of life after death this week. And today's episode will probably be kind of short, but it does lead us into our final episode tomorrow, which I find to be one of the most fascinating aspects of life after death, and that is after-death communication. So, today, though, we will be talking about near-death experiences. So, I don't know how many of you have ever, become critically ill or had an experience where you have died and come back to life or come close to death and had anything like this, or if you had experiences. If you have, please again comment below. I'd love to hear it. If it's something private, you can email me at thetalkingstickcollective@gmail.com, and I'd love to interact with you on this topic. I myself have had a somewhat experience with this, although it was a little bit different than what we'll be talking about here. I would love to share it, and I'll probably share it at the end of the video. But near-death experiences have been something that have been, recorded since ancient times. As far as medical reports from doctors, the oldest known medical report was written by Pierre-Jean du Monchot, an 18th century French military doctor, who described a case in his book that he wrote. It's Antidotes of Medicine. He hypothesized that an influx of blood in the brain stimulated a strong feeling in the individual and therefore caused a near-death experience, although I don't know how many doctors would actually corroborate that now, in a sense, because we do have a lot more information. It's rarely common for hospice workers as well to very much believe in a life after death concept, as well as have a common thread with these experiences. So in that people of all walks of life, of all spiritual belief systems, will have these experiences. And it's sort of been debunked, about the idea that, you can, that it's just like some element of the dying brain that actually is experiencing these things. We do release DMT, a natural, form of DMT in the brain during any type of extreme pain, trauma, birth, and death. So, I think that's probably where these very mystical experiences that we experience with DMT, if you've ever done it, I've never really explored it. I have sort of a reservation about it because, we don't really know what taking a synthetic version of that does to the stores of DMT in the brain and how quickly it actually replenishes itself, because it is very rarely used by the body. So, for me, it's like I don't want to smoke DMT one day and die 3 hours later, and then there's no DMT left in my brain to actually soften the experience of death. And because it often is very painful, or any other traumatic, painful experience that I may experience within a short or succinct period of time following the use of the synthetic form of DMT. So for me, I still am on the fence about it. That doesn't mean I always will be, but for now, it's not really something I've ever experienced. So anyhow, there is a lot of information surrounding the subject, and like I said, it will be a fairly short episode. So if you are interested, I really encourage you to look into it. There is a story, and I can't remember his name right now, honestly. Unfortunately enough, I didn't prepare on this tip, but when I was researching this, after Eden passed away, I sort of dove in and became very obsessed with this subject of life after death and what happened to her, where she is at, how to connect with her. I really would love to dream more about her, and have those experiences. And it actually is what part of what drives me to not, smoke weed or any type of cannabis product, because it does, affect melatonin in the brain, which does affect dreaming and your ability to remember dreams. So, anyhow, there was a doctor who was actually a neuroscientist, and I will go and look him up and get his name so you can look into him. He's become one of the leading actual, you know, doctors to study this phenomenon, and he basically had this form of meningitis that shut down all the parts of his brain that would be necessary for it to actually be having these hallucinatory features during the time that he was in, a coma. He was in a coma. And during the time in that coma, he had such a profound experience in, whether you want to call it the afterlife, the other side, an alternative dimension, whatever you want to call it. He did have such a profound experience that he came back and he was actually didn't believe in God or any, that he just thought, as a lot of scientists do, that when you pass on, it's done. That's it. You go to the grave, you become dirt, whatever, worm food, whatever you want to say. That was where he was at prior to this experience. And so, it was so profound to him that he just began to study and, really look into this concept and like, how could this have happened? And of course the neuroscientists, they know more about the brain than anybody. So, he very much was determined that there's no other explanation for it. The parts of his brain were dead, like at that point, that they were not functioning, and they have, scans and all of this information. So anyhow, I'm not going to go any further because I encourage you to look him up. Like I said, I will include a link below on him and his journey. I really, if you're interested in this, I really advise you to look into him. So anyhow, Bruce Greyson, Kenneth Ring, and Michael Sabom, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a cardiologist, helped to launch the field of near-death studies and introduce the study of near-death experiences to the academic setting. From 1975 to 2005, some 2,500 self-reported individuals in the U.S. alone were reviewed in retrospective studies of the phenomena, with an additional 600 outside the U.S. in the West and 70 in Asia. Additionally, prospective studies had identified 270 individuals outside of those as well. So they review groups of individuals, like selected emergency room patients, and that have experienced these extreme have had these extreme experiences with their health, and had a near-death experience, or an NDE as it's called, and began to really look into each individual case and find the lines. So in all, close to 3,500 individual cases between 1975 and 2005 had been reviewed in some aspect of this study. They were carried out by over 55 researchers or teams of researchers. So Melvin Morse, the head of the Institute for Scientific Study of Consciousness, and his colleagues actually also studied it in pediatric populations, which to me seems super interesting because, unlike adults, children do not have a lot of preconceived ideas of what may happen, or spiritual beliefs or religious beliefs. So it seems like, that would be super interesting, and it was through this that I actually realized that was real. So I'm going to actually go into Melvin's work and look more into this afterward. I didn't want to have too long of an episode here because we did have a few long ones earlier in the week. And so, again, Melvin L. Morse is his name, and I think that's very, very much worth looking into. As we discussed yesterday with children and their past life memories, they just don't have the same level of preconceived ideas that we have. So I think there's even more validity to their experience, not to invalidate anyone else or any adults here. But so there are some common elements that they have found over these studies that, and also Brian Weiss, I have read quite a few of his books, and they are on Audible. So if you're interested in this, I do encourage you to look him up, Weiss, and, see what he has to say on the subject. So he's actually, I think, does like past life regression, so you can, through hypnosis, do past life regression as well. So we discussed that in the last episode. But anyhow, Bruce Grayson argues that the general features of the experience include impressions of being outside one's physical body, visions of the deceased relatives and religious figures, and transcendence of the egoic and spatiotemporal boundaries. So, although the person's interpretation of these events will often correspond with their personal, cultural, philosophical, or religious beliefs. So, it's like, basically like, some people say, you say tomato, I say tomato, basically, in the sense of, are they calling them angels? Are they meeting up with Jesus or, Osiris? You know what I mean? Like, it's like, it just depends on what your belief system is, I think, and so the interpretive value of what you're experiencing is then, basically influenced by that. So, for example, in the U.S., where 46% of the population believes in guardian angels, so they will often identify these energies that greet them in this realm as, angels or even deceased relatives. And while Hindus will identify them as messengers of the god of death. So, it's relative in the way that the person describes it, but really it seems to have a very similar, contextual nature. So yeah, these are some of the common traits, again, are a sense of or an awareness of being dead or passed over. It seems to be very succinct. They realize that they have left their bodies very quickly. Also, at this point, a sense of peace, well-being, and painlessness. So while in this realm, they feel very much at peace, a great, intense feeling of well-being, and whatever pain they may have been or may be in their bodily state at that moment is not being felt by their soul. So positive emotions and just being a sense of being removed from the world and the physical 3D. So it can be described as an out-of-body experience wherein a perception of one's body from an outside position is being held, and sometimes observing the medical professionals performing resuscitation efforts. Now, there is, again, if you look into these doctors and you look into, their studies and what they've actually found out, that there are some who will actually, in these rooms where they work, in the hospitals where they work, I don't know who's been in the emergency room or at a doctor's office, those cabinets are super high and like close to the ceiling, maybe this much from the ceiling or whatever, and the doctors will actually put messages up above, on pieces of paper on top of the counters, and tell no one, not any other doctors or the nurses, what they say or that they're even there. And people will actually have these experiences where they leave their body, and initially they're in the room of where their body is being resuscitated, and they can recount what the doctors were saying and what was going on from a third person perspective. Now, there is, that's actually arguable by science, and many believe that that's just, the person is still having an auditory capability during that time, even though their heart has stopped. And I mean, I know of one story of a woman who was actually kayaking, and she was going to go down one of the waterfalls that was more conducive with her skills and with her vehicle, her kayak. And when she approached this, and she was very good at this, and she was not like a newbie at kayaking, but when she approached this waterfall, there was someone that was stuck horizontally against a rock, and she couldn't traverse and get around them. So she ended up taking like a left and going down the next waterfall down. And that one ended up being like, you know, whatever, triple diamond or black diamond, whatever you call it when you're snowboarding. It was like to that effect, but a waterfall, you know, a really steep and crazy waterfall. And so she ends up going down and becoming pummeled and pushed underwater by the force of the waterfall itself, and gets stuck in her kayak in a rock, behind a rock under the water. And I think she was underwater for something like 25 to 30 minutes, dead, and had a very, very profound near-death experience wherein she went to the other side and received information. And some of the information was that one of her then very young sons would pass away at a very young age. And so, I mean, the poor woman, like, that fear. I mean, I had that fear just because of the experiences I had of losing, you know, my cousin and my stepbrother at a young age. I had that fear myself, and just to have it be so backed by like this experience, wow, that must have been terrifying. So anyhow, she was very paranoid, you know, throughout his life. And once he turned 18, she sort of breathed a sigh of relief that it was wrong, you know, that whatever happened to her, despite however profound it may have been and changed her life in other ways, that they had been wrong, or somehow the timeline shifted and, you know, her son was going to be okay. But then lo and behold, at like 21 years old or something, he went on a hike with his friends and in some freak way ended up passing on. So it did end up being, you know, truth be told. So yeah, super interesting. Like I said, look up these stories. There's tons of them. And, you know, while some of them aren't so interesting or are kind of typical, some of them are super interesting, and the people come back with, you know, profound truths. So anyhow, a tunnel experience, or entering a darkness, a sense of moving up or through a passageway or even staircase. So, you know, the Stairway to Heaven song comes to mind. A rapid movement toward and or sudden immersion in a powerful light or being of light which communicates telepathically with the person. Now, this is definitely something that is experienced, you know, by people who have done, who this has happened to. And also hospice workers do talk about this experience with people who are ready to pass over, who are in their final days and sort of in between worlds, right? An intense feeling of unconditional love and acceptance, encountering beings of light, beings dressed in white, or being reunited with deceased loved ones. And again, that's something the hospice workers say as people are between worlds. They'll come back and still be talking in their body and still be alive, but talking to passed on, you know, loved ones. Experiencing euphoria and euphoric environments filled with light. And you know, a lot of people do say that the colors are stunning and absolutely amazing. Something unlike any, it's like otherworldly, bright and vivid colors. Receiving a life review or seeing one's life flash before their eyes. And I've also heard it be said that they will then experience their life from the perspective of the people around them as well. So, you know, it's not just from their own perspective in a repeated, you know, experience, but also then from, you know, say the perspective of the people whom they touched in a positive way, you know, or even the people they hurt and the pain that they caused, you know, to learn from it. And so then approaching a border or a decision by oneself or others to return to one's body, often often accompanied by a lack of desire to come back. I mean, so that also corroborates with what we'll talk about for tomorrow's episode, which is, after death communications, and how commonly it is like, oh, it's beautiful here, it's great, like, wait till you get here. So suddenly finding oneself back inside one's body, in connection to cultural beliefs held by the individual, they seem to dictate some of the phenomena, but more so affects later in the interpretation. And then meeting the dead and hallucinating ghosts in an afterlife environment. So, that's sort of repetitive, but, it's also very important not to confuse an OBE, so an out-of-body experience, with an NDE, the near-death experience, because you can have an out-of-body experience. I've actually had one of those as well, completely not inspired. Like, I started reading about this type of stuff when I was extremely young, after a really crazy experience with the Ouija board, or the talking board. That wasn't evil, it was actually very religiously based, the experience I had. But then, as a voracious child, where I just loved to read and learn, even as a child, I began to look into these things and read about, and I believe it was Brian Weiss' book, Many Masters, Many Lives, that I read. I don't remember which one it was, but the out-of-body experience, to me was dangerous. I thought, because there's like some possibility of being like possessed or something after that. And, so it's never been something I actually tried to do, but it did happen to me without trying once. And I was completely sober and like breastfeeding Gaia. So it was not something that I would say is drug-induced even. So an out-of-body experience is a part of the near-death experience. So it can happen when someone is about to die, or something other than that: fainting, deep sleep, and alcohol or drug use. So for me, it was actually, I was falling asleep when it happened. And in that experience, you will see the world from outside your body. And I did. I actually literally saw the entire world. I was in space. I went all the way out to space. And it was like falling backwards. And I couldn't stop it. It was like, it was just happening. And of course, it felt like falling. So I had my eyes closed, but I literally felt the thickness of the ceiling. And as I got outside, I could feel the elements around me, and wind and temperature. And then suddenly that all went, and it felt like I was just falling really fast. And then it suddenly stopped, and it became still. And when it did, I opened my eyes, my ethereal eyes, to see. And I actually could see, it was like being in space and looking at the earth. And, I remember thinking, I didn't realize the clouds made, shadows on the earth. And, the idea of it being half light and half dark, like a yin and yang sign, I remember thinking. And then suddenly I had this like, oh my gosh, like moment. I had this, it was maybe like a minute of, wow, like dreamy. And then suddenly I was like, wait a minute, what the hell am I doing in space? And as soon as I did that, it was like, it was like right back in my body. I sat up. I didn't even end up really going to sleep, and it was only a few minutes of time. So, I myself have had like a really weird experience, again, in sobriety, of out of body. So, again, another subject that I won't go any further into, but so out of body, and near-death experiences, another phenomena that relates to the idea that our soul is indeed, as many of these religions and spiritual beliefs do believe, that we discussed earlier in the week, around like reincarnation and stuff, that the soul then maintains as a separate entity, sort of like, one of my favorite analogies is, each lifetime is like a new car, and we are still the same driver of the car, but each car we get into, we have more and more experience from the last car that we drove, and more time on the road as we get into, this new car, and eventually we're a race car driver, and we can, then no longer, maybe then we become an airplane pilot, who knows, but, so the idea is that while we get into different cars, we're still the same driver. And I really think that's applicable to, our soul's path and reincarnation and coming back here. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I really enjoyed being here talking about it, as you can tell. So, I almost forgot. I almost forgot to tell you about my near-death experience, because it wasn't like this. It was actually a little bit different. I had an experience where I lost over like half of my blood. I probably shouldn't have lived through it, but I did. And in that experience, as I was kind of losing consciousness and coming in and out of it, I remember my body feeling really heavy, and I couldn't lift my body up. I couldn't sit up anymore. I had a really hard time even opening my eyes and focusing. And at the time, my daughter Gaia, I was in the emergency room, my daughter Gaia was with me, and the medical staff at the Joshua Tree Hospital was being, very negligent in a lot of ways, honestly. And they weren't listening. And she was becoming very afraid, but she was the only one in the room when we arrived. And I remember laying there and opening my eyes slightly and seeing Eden there. And at the time, Eden was still with me. And she was a teenager. She was 18 and was not in the house at the time, though, but was local. So she could have shown up. So it didn't really trigger me in any way. And then a few minutes later, I opened my eyes again, and Neil was there, my friend Neil. And at the time, Neil was in Europe, touring Europe, with the Brotherhood. And so, the Chris Robinson Brotherhood. So I remember thinking, like, what the hell is he doing here? Even though he was a close friend of mine, and had he somehow been local and I was in the hospital and he knew it, he'd likely show up. But nah, he was in Europe, and I knew that. And so in my mind, that's what triggered me, and I was able to lift my arm, and I started pulling off all the things on my body to like in a movie or something, to cause the alarms to go off. And that's when they came in. They immediately started panicking. I didn't even have time. I had to verbally consent to blood transfusions. They couldn't put me under to stop the bleeding and surgically until they gave me blood. First, because I was so low in blood volume, and I remember looking at my blood pressure at the time, and it was like, 53 over 35 or something, 50s over 30s, and I mean, it's supposed to be like 110 over 70 or something, like 105 over 70. And so literally describing half blood, I had half the blood pressure I should, because I had half the blood I should. And so had that not happened in that moment, I may have just slipped away in front of my daughter, and that would have been just horrible, and for many reasons. Now, the reason this actually kind of, is strange to me is because within a few years, I lost both Neil and Eden. And, it's like, just makes me think stuff like, well, were they so close to, their own end of life that they were able to sort of come back, through the timeline somehow, or the timeline lift that may happen once we cross over, were they able to come back, to sort of keep me here and save me, sort of like guardian angels that, although they hadn't passed on yet, I hallucinated the two people that I am now, that I lost within 8 months of each other, that were, part of the triad of people that I actually, prayed for every night. And so very, very interesting to me, and I credit that with saving my life, honestly. So although it wasn't traditional, it does seem to be some type of near-death experience wherein, energies and things are at play and stuff like that. So that's my experience. So anyhow, once again, now I really will end it. Thanks again. Thanks so much for being here. I can't express to you how much gratitude I have for you and your support, here, and for me and the channel and the concept and learning and human connection and love. So thank you. And I hope that you will join us tomorrow for our final episode in this week's theme, being life after death. which is after death communication. I've got some pretty cool stories, and it will be mostly that. So I hope to see you there, and so that we can take one more step in our efforts to show, grow, and glow here on planet Earth, and as humans and in our human community. Okay, so I will see you there tomorrow, where it will be Happy Friday once again. So yeah, until then, thanks so much, you guys. Have a great night, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.